Hi, I'm Paul Young, a partner in the firm of Young, Mar, Malice and Associates. Welcome to the Paul Squared podcast. I've been helping clients file for bankruptcy relief and Social Security claims since 1986. I created this podcast to provide an overview of the bankruptcy and Social Security disability process and hopefully answer the most frequently asked questions. My goal is to help clients regain financial stability and support them through the challenging times of either being unable to work or pay their bills due to a disability. While this podcast serves to provide some general guidelines around the practice areas we discuss, you should always consult directly with an attorney to make sure the specifics of your particular situation match up with the various laws within those areas. The decision of choosing an attorney is an important one, and you should give it careful thought before deciding. If you need representation or just have any questions, please feel free to contact me at 215 639 5297 or visit our website at www.youngmarlaw.com. That's YOUNGMARRLAW.com. That's youngmarlaw.com. Thank you.
Welcome to episode 2 of Paul Squared, Legal Insights into Criminal, Bankruptcy, and Disability Law, brought to you by Paul Young and Paul Malice. In episode 2 today, we're back with Paul Young, and we're going to get into the nuances of bankruptcy law and what it means to potentially file a bankruptcy filing, the steps that go into this. And this is actually going to be broken up into 2 episodes because there's a lot to talk about on this. But in episode 2, again, back with Paul Young. Paul, welcome to episode 2 of the podcast.
Welcome, Pete. Thank you for having me.
So what I'd like to do in this episode is sort of just talk through some of the basics of bankruptcy. I know there's a lot of specifics that go into this, and there are versions of bankruptcy that deal with real estate. There's versions of bankruptcy that deal with other types of debt, and we'll kind of talk through as much of that as possible to give people a good overview. But the primary purpose of this is to really help people to understand what goes into the process and understanding of making a decision as to whether bankruptcy is the right choice for you, and if so, the steps that go into actually making that happen. So the first question that I have for you, Paul, based upon that basic concept is, can you provide a little background on why bankruptcy laws were even brought into existence, and what's their purpose? What's the reason that bankruptcy even exists?
Sure. Well, years ago, I mean, obviously people have heard about, there really were debtors' prisons, and there were no alternatives for people who reached a certain point financially that they just couldn't dig themselves out. And that's really why bankruptcy laws are in existence. Generally, it's to, in some way, recognize that unfortunately they've reached a point that they need assistance, whether it be they're overwhelmed with credit debt or other forms of debt, whether it's they're losing their home, whether they're getting a car repossessed. It's some way to provide a legal alternative to some financial assistance such that they get some relief and find a path to move forward.
And you mentioned the term debtor's prison, and just so people understand, there was a point in time, and this has been quite a while at this point, but that you could be put in jail if you were unable to pay your bills. That's not the case anymore, correct?
No, correct. Today, there's no debtor's prison, but sometimes people feel like they're in what would be akin to a debtor's prison because they just can't seem to find, without the assistance of bankruptcy, a way to get out from the quagmire that they're in.
And is it fair to say that the bankruptcy laws were designed to say, look, we're not going to throw people in jail for having debt. That's unfair. That's not how they want to handle this. That the bankruptcy laws are saying we need to protect people's ability to live, to work, to be able to get themselves out of this debt situation and hopefully not repeat the situation again. Is that a fair assessment of what the primary purpose of bankruptcy laws are designed to do?
Exactly. I mean, there's different there's different reasons people have reached that point. Sometimes it's job loss, sometimes it's illness, but exactly, it's a mechanism for whether it's dealing with IRS debt, whether it's dealing with credit related debt, to give people an opportunity to at least see a light at the end of the tunnel. I mean,
Right.
that's really the purpose of bankruptcy, to for people to recognize I have a way that I can get myself into a better financial position and move forward. And as a country, and I think we've set up laws such that we want people to have that opportunity. It's not unlimited. It's one thing
Right.
I think that there's sometimes a misconception. There's certain limits on what you can or can't do, what you can or can't have to qualify. And I will get into that, I know, more specifically, but otherwise, there's always an opportunity to hopefully dig yourself out and move forward.
Yeah, and this isn't a decision to be made lightly, and it's not a decision to be made that, you have one credit card with a $500 balance, you just don't feel like paying it. There are consequences, there are rules around all this, but again, I would imagine that most people come to you have gotten to the point where they don't know any path forward to get themselves out from underneath this, doing what they're doing, earning what they're earning, trying to pay what they're paying, and that's why they come seek your counsel.
Most people who talk to me or meet with me about a bankruptcy don't want to be meeting with me. They don't
Right.
want to have to be talking to me. And by the time they've reached this point, they've most unfortunately have beaten themselves up. They're despondent about having to seek assistance, but yet afterwards, I think most people feel like they've accomplished something and they feel a sense of, okay, I'm moving in the right direction.
And then I think you mentioned in episode one that there's this sort of commonality that you often see where people feel like I'm the only one who's had this. They feel alone. They feel embarrassed. They feel whatever it might be, the emotions that are running through this. But the fact that laws are written around that there's a whole process to handle this alone, I think should tell people that you're not the first one. And it's not so uncommon that you're a unique situation coming into my office. There are laws designed around this because it happens so often.
Absolutely. And there's, I would say, I think every bankruptcy attorney can relate that the first portion when you're meeting with a client is usually the first portion of counseling them is that they can't believe that this could have happened to them, whether it was
Yeah,
whatever life circumstances were that brought them to your office. They never thought it would be them, and you have to let them know, and you have to assure them that they're not the first and they won't be the last, and that they're not. I mean, a line that I'll bring up to them is you're not committing a felony. You're doing
right.
something that's there for a reason to help you get back on your feet.
When you had mentioned, you can have health issues, you can lose your job, there can be these big, impactful life events that you can point to say, oh, well, that's sort of the cause or the catalyst for what I'm experiencing now. But I would imagine there's a lot of people that come to you that it's a slow drip of, I'll call it death by a thousand cuts, where it's just a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, where the cumulative effect of it is what puts them in a position and they don't see it coming. And that
Absolutely.
might be hard for them to digest to say, I don't know how I got here.
Absolutely. It's interesting in that there's all different people that you're meeting with for all different reasons, and one of them definitely is what you just described. They they've been paying, they've been paying, they've been paying, and they finally get to a point that the credit cards have raised their interest rates. They've and they just can't keep paying, and
Right.
that's definitely a percentage of the people I'm meeting with. Others are a more traumatic event, like a loss of a job or a health issue or an added expense that they didn't. But some are just life taking its toll, and it's been 15 years of still paying, and they're still here, and they
Right.
just now have gotten to a point they can't. I mean,
Or,
that's
or
robbing from Peter to pay Paul.
yeah, and in today's world as it is, I think inflation, I can't tell you
Absolutely,
how many people I've talked to who said, I could pay my bills last year and I can't pay them. I don't know what happened. It's everything got more
absolutely,
expensive. And,
absolutely. I
yeah,
think. Because one of the exercises we do when I'm meeting with someone about bankruptcy is I go through their income and their expenses and what people are paying for rent, what people spend on car payments, what people are spending on food compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It hasn't gone up incrementally, it's gone up exponentially. And
Right.
you see someone before who was paying $1,000 for rent, now they're paying 2,500.
Right.
It really, and yet their wages haven't kept up with it. That's caused a whole different set of circumstances that are very difficult.
Yeah, and I would imagine a lot of that too is that people's immediate sort of response to that might be, "Well, I'll just put more on the credit cards," and then this starts the snowball effect of eventually you run out of credit room, and the rate goes up, and the payment's higher, and you can't make the payment, and this is where it all begins. Um,
That's absolutely. I mean, I would say to you, the great majority of people who've reached that point are with the best intentions. They're using the cards to try to hang on, and they're paying they're for a number of years, and just they run out of rope.
and I guess that's a question. Does somebody have to get to that point before they can consider declaring bankruptcy or speaking to somebody like you? If someone has credit card room and they haven't used it up, do they still have the option to consider bankruptcy before they start adding on that additional debt?
Oh, sure. I'd say there's all different, again, groups of people. I'm meeting with some people who've never missed a payment, and they've just recognized I can't keep living like this.
Right.
There's other groups of people I'm meeting with who have missed payments for a number of months, maybe even years, and now they're being sued, and they kind of buried their head in the sand.
Yeah.
And that's just the credit related people. Then we have
Yeah.
people who are behind on mortgages, which is a whole different, or behind on car payments, where a car was repossessed, or they're threatening repossession. They have a whole different set of concerns.
Well, and to give people comfort, I mean, I think you did a good example of explaining some scenarios and how people get to where they are, and that it's not that unusual. Um, do you know some famous people you can point to who have declared bankruptcy, just to give people comfort level to say that you're not the only one?
No, I mean, John Wayne, Walt Disney, Mike Tyson. There's I can go on and on. There's a host. In fact, on my website, there's a host of famous people over the years, and that people would be Harry Truman. People
Yeah.
would be shocked that unfortunately had to file bankruptcy, and it's there because for various reasons. Even the what people would think are the most financially successful people, um, our president of the United States,
Yeah.
um, has filed bankruptcy. So it's there as a structure to help people. It's not there to destroy people. That would be my
Yeah.
message.
And I like to use the example Dave Ramsey.
Yep.
He's a well-known, I think, financial consultant guru out there. You see on the internet all the time talking to people about how to manage their finances and everything. He went through bankruptcy.
Yeah. The,
That was
the,
part of the turning point in his life. I think from his own experience and story that he needed to do that to reset himself to have the chance to get on firmer financial footing.
I can tell you that I don't think I've ever. I will discuss the differences, but I don't know that I've ever represented someone in a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and that's probably now three, 4,000 people that ever said to me after they filed, "I'm sorry I did." I would say the great majority have said what you're describing, that they feel like that helped propel them into a better situation, and also the stress relief that it provided
Yeah.
is just enormous because the burden is overwhelming, I think, to a lot of these people.
And along those lines, do you have people who come into your office with some common misconceptions or myths about bankruptcy that you find yourself answering regularly? And if you do, can you tell us what some of those are because they're so common?
Absolutely. I'd say the first and the most common is okay, I know I need to file, but I'm never going to have credit again. And that's probably the biggest misconception because you do reestablish credit. You absolutely can, and most people do, and much more quickly, I think, that people think. That's the most common misconception. I would say some of the others, people don't believe that you can still own a home or own a car, or that they don't recognize that you don't have to be in a situation where you have no assets. There's limits on what you can have, but that's another misconception that, well, if I file bankruptcy, are they going to take my home or my car? Um, so again, that's, I'd say, two or three of the most common misconceptions that people have, and I think the one other is there's a concern that, well, if I file for bankruptcy, they're worried about somehow there's a stigma and that people are going to, quote unquote, they're going to know. And it isn't. It's a private, even though if someone wanted to gain access to it, they could, but it's not widespread, and it's not something that your next door neighbor could have filed and you wouldn't know.
Right. It's not going to be an announcement in the
It's
newspaper.
not right, and that used to be the concern. Is it, one of the questions would be, is it going to be in the newspaper?
Right.
And it isn't. No one's going to know. And even if they did, it really isn't something. I realize no one wants it to be public knowledge, but I can tell you it's not something that you really need to be ashamed of. But no one is going to know if you want to keep it private.
Yeah. The reality is they'd have to really do some digging to find it,
Yes.
and most people are not that interested.
No, exactly. They're not going to go to
Yeah.
the resources to try to find it.
So you had sort of touched base on this a little bit, but there are different types of bankruptcy. Can you explain those? And I know there's largely two that you typically operate within whenever you're dealing with your clients. So can you explain what the types of bankruptcy are and what the differences are?
Sure, sure. There's a chapter 7, a chapter 13. There's also a chapter 11, which is primarily business reorganization. So I'm not going to go into that right now, but there are personal chapter 11s as well, but that's not too common. There's a chapter 12, which is a family farmer, which I'm very rarely dealing with, and there's also a chapter 5. But the most common for my purposes as a consumer attorney is representing people with chapter 7s and chapter 13s. By and large, a chapter 7 is a total discharge of unsecured debt. However,
Now
it's not.
you say unsecured debt. Can you just
Sure.
explain what that is?
Sure. Unsecured debt is essentially credit cards, personal loans, medical bills. It's anything that's not secured by an asset. So usually the things that are secured are going to be car loans and homes. So the
It's
way I
something
just
that could be repossessed if you didn't pay it.
Yes, yes, exactly. And the way I generally describe it to people is a chapter 7 bankruptcy, if they're filing, is neutral as to a home or a car, meaning it's not going to assist them in helping to catch up in those areas. It's going to get rid of the other debt in their lives, provided they qualify. And there's
Right.
certain qualifiers for Chapter 7. You can't have over a certain income. You can't have over a certain amount of assets. Yeah, and you couldn't have filed within the last 8 years. Those are the three. So that's a Chapter 7. A Chapter 13 is a repayment plan of at least a portion of the debt. Um, that's one person who's filing a Chapter 13. Another person might be to catch up on mortgage arrears. So that's a person who's filing a 13, or somebody who maybe wants to prevent a car repossession and they want to catch up on that other type of secured loan. So there's various reasons people file the two, but those are the differences. One, in a nutshell, a Chapter 7 does not have a repayment plan, and it will get rid of what we're referring to as unsecured debt. A 13 is going to have a repayment plan, and it can serve various purposes. It can help you deal with a car that's delinquent, or you can deal with the mortgage arrears, or it could just deal with unsecured debt for people who don't qualify for Chapter 7.
So when somebody comes into you, you really need to sit down with them and talk about their situation, what assets they have. Do they have debt out there that's secured against a physical thing that could be repossessed versus just credit cards or something like that to help them understand this is the right path forward for you and what one means over the other.
Yes, you really do have to assess a person's situation and really present them with different options. I mean, for example, I spoke to someone like yesterday afternoon, in fact, where they're I'm meeting with them Monday. They have a choice. If they want it, they're thinking about keeping. They're behind on their car payment. If they want to deal with the car issue, they would have to file a Chapter 13, where they could also get rid of their credit debt potentially and discharge it, but they have a payment plan relating to their car. On the other hand, they might be getting another car from a parent, in which case a Chapter 7 might be the more viable option. They might just what's known as surrender the vehicle, and in that case, just file a Chapter 7 and wouldn't be dealing with a repayment on that vehicle. So those are the type of things that you have to, in my opinion, the best way of approaching it is hearing the totality of the circumstances and then presenting them with both options. And it's always their choice.
Right. But it really requires discussion and somebody who understands the nuances about why this fact that may not seem critical or important to them is going to be important in making the proper decision.
And I think that's something that really does come with experience and of dealing with enough cases. Because, again, one of the things that I briefly mentioned in the last podcast that when I've had younger attorneys, one of the things I've had to kind of teach them is you have to listen. It's easy to
Right.
write down the information. You have to listen and help these people sort through what are your options, and then help them make the choice as to what their better option is, and provide them guidance in that regard.
Yep. Absolutely. And I think for the remainder of this particular podcast episode, we're going to focus a little more on chapter sevens because the next episode, episode 3, we're going to dig a little bit further into bankruptcy or 13s. And I know there's crossover between the two. There's decision making that can affect both of them, but I'm going to kind of get into some details or ask questions that are more related about sevens
Sure.
moving forward. There is something in the bankruptcy process that's called the means test. Can you explain what that is and how it's calculated?
Sure. Just to give you a brief history, which will help, I think, better explain the means test. In 2005, there were massive bankruptcy law changes. Prior to 2005, I would meet with the client and I would look at their income and expenses, and I would make a decision as to do I think they're a proper candidate for a Chapter 7 or a 13. And I would solely make that decision. I would file it. If I filed as a Chapter 7, the U.S. trustee had a right, who oversees the whole process, to object, saying, no, I think they're better suited for a 13. Their income could provide for something. And so it was very subjective. They came up in 2005 with the law change with something called the means test, where they look at your last 6 months' earnings, and there's a formulaic approach to deciding, does this person qualify income wise for a
Okay.
Chapter 7 bankruptcy? And they wanted to eliminate the subjectivity. So what they did is it's based on household size and median income. And it's become somewhat of a math equation. So they go by the last 6 months household earnings. I plug that in based on household size, and then certain other exemptions or deductions you get in this means test. So, for example, daycare, and if you have certain others, and then it's going to tell us, does that person income wise qualify for a Chapter 7 bankruptcy? That's at least the starting point for
Okay.
determining. So that's what the means test basically is.
And is it fair to say that part of the reasoning behind the means test and this process is that they want to understand, hey, are people making enough money that what's better for them and the creditors is to put them in a plan that's going to allow them to pay it back over time, give them the wiggle room to pay it in a way it's affordable versus just getting rid of a bunch of debt and saying, "Hey, you don't owe this anymore." Maybe they're saying you're making too much, you should be paying
Yeah,
something back.
exactly. And I think it always existed. They're
Right.
not a means test, but a way of doing that. But I think they didn't want it to be as subjective as it's up to the individual attorney and the U.S. trustee to decide.
Right.
So yes, but I think a key point, Pete, is with the means test. I think one you were talking about before misconceptions. I think one misconception people have sometimes when they do a little bit of research is if you're a Chapter 7, you discharge the debt. If you're a 13, you repay the debt. And it isn't quite, you might be in a 13 where you're only paying back a small portion. So
Right.
you're right. The purpose was to determine should there be any repayment made,
Right.
or is somebody in a point that a Chapter 7 is more appropriate and they can't afford any repayment.
So it could be a combination of the two. Some debt's discharged, some of it goes into the bucket that needs to be paid back on a plan that the
Yes,
person can afford.
exactly.
Okay. So have you ever had the situation where someone comes to you and says, I want to file for Chapter 7. I think I can't make my bills anymore. I'm in this position, but my spouse doesn't want to. Or is that an issue, or how do you navigate a system like that where there's not an agreement?
Okay, that's actually very common.
Okay.
I'll get someone who calls me or contacts me who says that they want to file, but they don't want their spouse to be involved. Their spouse doesn't want to participate. And the problems that I run into in that regard is the way the system is set up. The spouse doesn't need to file. Their name isn't on the petition. Their social security number isn't on the petition, but all the tests that we've discussed, the means test, and even looking at their household income and their household expenses, they go by both parties' incomes. So sometimes the reluctance is my spouse doesn't want to provide me their income information. It might be a second marriage, and the spouse wants nothing to do with the process. And unfortunately, I have to involve the spouse, at least from a standpoint of getting their income information. So they don't have to file, but they do have to be involved from a standpoint of their income being at least calculated into the decisions that can be made.
But filing is on an individual basis. It doesn't have to be, hey, both spouses have to be in on this together or not, unless maybe it's related to a house that both their names is on, or some other type of shared debt.
Even in that situation, one spouse can be filing.
Okay.
But if more cases than not, I would say probably statistically more people file jointly than individually, but a fair number do file individually. And most times spouses are part of the process and they're fine with providing the information I need. I only need a limited amount of information. I really need their
Right.
income information, sometimes their expense information. So they're usually fine with that. But you do run into situations where that I have had over the years where that's an impediment. Somebody who wants to file just decides they can't because their spouse really isn't a willing participant and I have to have some of their information at least to do it.
Yeah. Well, in a Chapter 7, is there any debt that will never be discharged? Is there any types of debts that are out there that just won't be discharged in a bankruptcy proceeding in Chapter 7s in
Ye-
particular?
yes. There's in a chapter 7, first of all, the types of debt we described before that's secured, car loan, a mortgage. As I always describe to people, if you want to keep the asset, the payments are going to have to continue if you want to keep it. Now you can surrender a car and then it would be discharged. Otherwise, those debts aren't affected. Other debts that student loans, which people know quite a bit about by now, are in the great majority of cases not dischargeable, despite talk of making them more dischargeable over the years. And since I started practicing years and years ago, 35 years ago, let's say, for example, student loans, there was a whole different set of rules concerning dischargeability. But now it's very rare that student loans are discharged, and certain types of taxes are dischargeable and certain ones aren't. So newer taxes, any that have occurred within 3 years from the date the tax became due, are not dischargeable. They're called priority tax debt. Taxes that are over a certain number of years old, as long as they were filed, the returns were filed, those are dischargeable in most cases. So, and there's certain other debts as well that fit within the confines of non-dischargeability. Something called fraud and false pretenses. If there was a debt that the creditor would be alleging was somehow fraudulent in how it was obtained, that wouldn't be dischargeable. But the great majority of again, unsecured debt, things that aren't secured by usually a car or a piece of property, with the exception of taxes and student loans, are dischargeable.
Gotcha. And it goes back to the importance of you need to have a discussion with someone who can understand the nuances of the type of debt, to make sure that you understand what the end result's going to be of all this.
And in fact, one thing that it's just a practice that I've developed over the years is sometimes I'll get a call from someone or I'll be speaking with someone and they'll say, well, I spoke to someone, so I understand what can be done in a bankruptcy. And I'd still rather start from the beginning because unfortunately, sometimes again, not to give examples, but I just, again, this was on yesterday where I spoke to someone who had filed bankruptcy, yet they knew nothing about the means test. They knew nothing about, I could talk more about this, but something called the state exemptions, where there was an issue as to the equity in their home and what needed to be done. And none of that was, so I never assume that these people are made aware of it. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. And you're right. I think a thorough discussion, because the consequences are really, really dramatic if there's a mistake.
Right. Right. I'm sure that the bankruptcy courts do not want to see something that isn't done properly from the beginning. Can a creditor take money from someone's paycheck or freeze their bank accounts? Is that ever a possibility?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, a common call that we receive is from someone who unfortunately has a bank account frozen. That's probably one of the most panicked situations I'll be dealing with when I'm dealing with a client, is because they all of a sudden don't have access to their money. They can't pay their bills. They can't. they- they're panicked, and yeah, any judgment creditor can freeze an account. Now, regarding regarding wage garnishments, that it can occur in certain states. I practice in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Wage garnishments do occur in New Jersey. Pennsylvania is not a wage garnishment state, but in essence, it has the same impact with direct deposit, because the great majority of people get direct deposited. So all of a sudden their bank account's frozen, their wages have been garnished in essence because it's been deposited in their bank account.
And
So
a garnishment, it just for a description, is that a creditor who has gotten a judgment in certain states like New Jersey could go to the person's employer and say, "Hey, this money's coming to me. I have a court order that says you can't distribute it or distribute it all out to this person. You have to cut my portion off of it before they ever receive anything."
absolutely, and it's a double whammy,
Yeah.
because number one, the person's affected financially. Number two, they're in a situation oftentimes where they didn't necessarily want their employer to know their financial situation, and now all of a sudden their employer's on notice that this person has a judgment against them. They're uncomfortable with that, especially if it's a smaller company.
Yeah. And, how long would you say is a typical process to get through a Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing from the minute someone comes into your office and says, "Here's my situation," to the point where they're getting some relief from the bankruptcy system?
Well, it really depends on how quickly it is that they want to file. If they is from the date, let's say from the date they meet with me and then file, so that could be as quickly as they need to or want to. Once they file the bankruptcy, they have a hearing which is called a creditors meeting, approximately 1 month after. And then of course, we're present with them at that creditors meeting. And then 60 to 90 days after that, they receive a discharge. So it's a quick process in a Chapter 7. From the date it's filed, it's about, give or take, 3 to 4 months.
Okay. So that's a reasonable expectation for someone to say, hey, if they're at that point that they feel they have to make a decision, they could expect to have some finality or relief in 3 to 4 months of the
Yep.
point of.
If they want to expedite, meaning if they want to move along as quickly as possible, yes, they can. It sometimes takes a little bit longer because they have to provide, for example, certain things to us, like pay stubs, tax returns, bank statements. Some people move at their own pace in that regard. It might take an extra month or so, so it really depends on the person. But yeah, once we start the process from a standpoint of filing, it moves along very quickly.
Okay. And so for someone who's filed a Chapter 7, I'm sure oftentimes you're getting the questions or concerns about what's this going to do to my credit score? And as you mentioned, they may have this myth that they can't get credit cards again or loans. Can you talk, number one, about what are some of the effects of filing a bankruptcy as it relates to people's creditability? And then also, what are some things that they can do following a bankruptcy to start to build that back up again?
Sure, sure. First thing I always point out to people is I don't want to ever suggest that bankruptcy is a panacea or something that should be taken lightly. So if someone's meeting with me, and as I was saying, there's all different types of people I'm meeting with. There's some people I'm meeting with who their credit scores are in the 700s, because they haven't, they just feel that they're going to fall behind. Those people, sure, they're going to feel a little bit of taking a step back before they go forward again. For the vast majority of people I'm meeting with, they're going to see their credit score improve dramatically because their credit score already is suffering. Some are steps that they take to improve their credit are happening naturally because they're going to continue to pay on a car payment. They're going to continue to pay on a mortgage, a home equity loan. Those things are going to help their credit score improve immensely immediately. Other steps they take, I tell everyone, once you're discharged, you're going to be, which is the end of the process, they're going to be offered a number of unsecured debt. In fact, there's a component when you file bankruptcy, you have to take an educational course online. There's 2 parts to it. The second part has to do with don't extend yourself to the point that it's going to cause another issue again, and because you're going to be offered so much credit. So I do suggest to people, though, that they do take 1 or 2 credit cards that they'll be offered, use it wisely, pay it each month, and that's going to help restore credit. And certainly, again, anything that's a secured loan that remains, like a car loan or a mortgage or a home equity, is going to help them.
And I guess one of the questions I'm sure you get asked as well are, somebody's filed bankruptcy in the past, can they do it again? Or what's the rules around the availability for bankruptcy somebody may have filed it before?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, the majority of people don't end up filing another Chapter 7. Occasionally, though, it does happen. There's an 8-year period of time where you can't refile a Chapter 7. So it used to be 6, and when they changed the law in 05, it became 8. So it's 8 years from the date of filing. You're eligible to refile another Chapter 7 if need be. And it happens, again, for the reasons we discussed. Sometimes I don't think anybody anticipates it, but maybe they've gotten credit, and unfortunately they were making payments. Something happened in their life again. Maybe it's an unexpected job loss, and now they're behind the 8 ball. And some of those people who refile recognize that there's certainly life after bankruptcy, and they just recognize that unfortunately they've hit a turn in the road where it's necessary, and so they decide it's something that unfortunately they have to do again and go on with their life from there.
And do you have people that come in and talk to you about their situation and you recommend to them you shouldn't be filing bankruptcy, that
A-
there are other paths forward for you?
Absolutely. I'd say the most common in that circumstance, and I've been finding this more and more, is circumstances where I meet with an older person who has a certain amount of unsecured debt. They don't really they have a lot of equity in their home, which we'll discuss, I know, more in a Chapter 13 setting. They would have to pay that back, and they'll say to me, "But I really can't afford that kind of payment." I'll discuss with them the merits of a reverse mortgage, and I think it's unfortunately, a reverse mortgage is one of those things that it's had a very negative connotation for various reasons over the years. But it really does serve a purpose, and I think it's become a tool in some of what I do in advising some of these older individuals. You really might want to consider a reverse mortgage rather than a bankruptcy, because you're really not in a financial position to make this work in a bankruptcy, but you are a appropriate candidate for a reverse mortgage. That's a real option for certain people.
And I think that, I'm sure one of the stigmas or concerns for a lot of people to come talk to you are about, we already mentioned this a bit. What are people going to say when they hear I filed bankruptcy and things like that? Do you have any advice or talk to people about how or if they explain to anybody, hey, I had to file bankruptcy, here's what it means? Or you find that most people don't know and will never know, and it's just do it if it's right for you, and chances that anybody's going to find out about it are slim.
I would say the latter is more the case, unless usually the people that they're discussing it with are people that they're close to, people usually that understand. You'd have to go to do a lot of research to find out if somebody filed if you weren't familiar. So I'd say that's less of a concern than it used to be for whatever reason. I think people now, and surprisingly, the great majority of cases that we get are referrals where people, when I say surprisingly, people feel so much better about their circumstances after they filed, that when they hear someone else who's in financial distress, they want to express to them what a bankruptcy might do for them. So I would say, compared to even years ago, the stigma that people felt isn't as great. And I think, in fact, they want to share with friends or family that, hey, this might be a remedy for somebody what you're feeling.
And if you were to, somebody's gone through bankruptcy, they're in a plan, and let's say that they're in a plan that may had some Chapter 7 elements of discharge debt, but may also have a 13 where there's payments in place. What happens if they miss a payment in the future?
Well, if they're in a Chapter 13, remember, the whole concept of a bankruptcy is it's debtor friendly. So if they have good communication with their attorney, if it's only going to be a temporary situation, they miss a payment, miss two pay, it's remediable. The situations that aren't is unfortunately something where maybe they're in a 13 for various reasons, and they've lost a job, and they don't know about in the foreseeable future if they're going to be able to make the payments that they would need to make. That might result in the case being dismissed, but at the same time, you're allowed to refile a Chapter 13 if it's dismissed. And I've had a lot of cases where it's succeeded 1, 2, 3 months later or 5 months later, when the person's now reemployed, they refile, and now they're back on course again with with a refile bankruptcy.
Gotcha. Well, Paul, we're just about to the end of episode 2.
Okay,
And
great.
if you were to give some advice to people who are considering whether bankruptcy makes sense for them or not, and knowing you've seen the mistakes that people have made in making this decision, what would be your parting advice to them? What's the one thing or couple things to remember in making that decision, whether this makes sense for them?
I would say first, if it's keeping you up at night and literally it's consuming your life, then there's things more important. that if there's an available path to bring some relief, you absolutely should really consider it. That would be my first advice and most important advice. That if it's consuming your life, then you really need to speak to someone, and to see if there's an option that makes sense, because there's life's too short. You don't want to be spending your waking hours just consumed, and too many people are, and it causes marital distress, it causes physical distress, emotional distress, and I think at that point you have to consider other options.
So it sounds like your advice would be don't wait, at least get educated, talk to somebody who can tell you what's realistic or not, and decide from there. But don't let it drag on forever.
Absolutely. You should be speaking to someone if you're in a position where it's causing emotional havoc, and at least then make a decision from that point.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was a lot of very useful information on bankruptcy in general and Chapter 7 specifically. In Episode 3, which will be coming up, we'll be diving into the nuances about Chapter 13 bankruptcies, which you alluded to a bit in this episode. But we invite everybody to come back and listen to learn a little bit more. Again, thank you for joining the Paul Squared podcast, and we'll see you on Episode 3.
Pete, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.